Thank you for tuning in to The Political Soup, where you hear editorial about the issues of the day and political philosophy. Your hosts are Nick Alex, our progressive, Dana and Pugh, our conservative, Paul Laws, our classical liberal, and here is our moderator and your host, John Toll.
Hello again, and welcome to the Political Soup podcast. I am your moderator, John Toll, and below me we have the usual suspects in reverse order today: Paul, Nick, and Dana. And I'm gonna start with actually Paul and jump around all over the place. It's gonna be a madhouse. But anyway, the article that we're talking about is actually from NPR. New Year's brings minimum wage hikes in 10 states. And essentially the article is talking about how it's up to local state governments if they want to raise it on top of what the federal's done, and whether or not those minimum wages are a good thing or not, and how that affects local businesses, whether it's positive or negative on state lines, all kinds of things of that nature. So again, I'm going to start out with Paul. I'm going to get Paul's opinion on the article. We'll post the link to it down below as usual, of course. So Paul, what do you think about the article and just the idea in general of minimum wages and you know, raising them up to kind of increase the standards of living or to try and match the standard of living?
Well, I think that minimum wages just in general are unnatural. Essentially what we're doing is we are telling a company that they can't pay for something that's market value. So we're setting an artificial low for something that has another low. The effect that generally has is that you know, a lot of the folks that would ordinarily be taking those jobs would either, number one, not get those jobs because they would be just eliminated, or they would be shipped overseas, shipped to another state, that sort of thing. You know, in general, these sorts of things are going to have the effect of slowing down job creation. They'll definitely have the effect of creating inflation, which is never a good thing. And you know, the ones that just went into effect, though, I mean, I don't think they're going to do all that much. Essentially, they're raising the minimum wage to a point that, you know, most people already make over that anyway. It's not probably going to affect too many people. You know, the folks that would have had the biggest effect have already been affected.
Now, it does say in the article that the higher wages should affect about 1 million people, just from, you know, going from wherever they're at now to the next step. And excuse me, the article talks about how this is going to affect a lot of small businesses in ways that might not be particularly useful. I mean, you know, you look at a small business that's paying close to the minimum wage or at the minimum wage, and you know, they're trying to incent their other workers that do a good job by giving them a little bit more. But if everybody comes up to that same level, now you've got everybody making the same thing, even whether you're a good worker or not. So that's one of the articles, or rather one of the points against it, which is matching up with what you're talking about. Dana, what are your thoughts on this subject?
Well, yeah, definitely what you said, it will affect other people, because when you raise the minimum wage, then you have to raise the amount that you pay your more experienced workers. This explains why unions typically support raising the minimum wage, because it will then, by necessity, all the other wages will have to go up as well. The problem is business owners aren't in the habit of just keeping stockpiles of money around. I think raising the minimum wage, or even having a minimum wage at all, is sort of predicated on the idea that businesses are withholding money from their workforce, and that the government can come along and just force them to pay their employees a little bit more with some of their spare reserves. This isn't the case. Inevitably, the money has to come from somewhere. Either there will be a workforce reduction at some point, there will be other cutbacks, or the prices of the product will have to rise, and the consumers will end up paying for it, which is, as Paul said, going to lead to inflation.
Okay, now theoretically, if I was a business owner, you know, I'm going to want to drag in all the money I can for myself. So, you know, if I was a greedy business guy, shouldn't I be able to afford this?
Typically, if you have extra money, you're going to use it to expand, and you're going to use it to hire more people. and this is going to slow that down. I don't know a whole lot of business owners who are just hitting it big and becoming rich, especially when their business is relatively small, at the expense of their employees. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I'm pretty sure that you're not going to find that there's a lot of business owners out there who are raking in hundreds of thousands of dollars a year and wishing to pay their employees a couple of bucks an hour.
Okay, and that brings up another point that I mentioned in the opening, is that they talk in the article about some of the conditions on state lines where two different states have big discrepancies between their minimum wages. And I think they were talking about the difference between Washington State and Idaho, and there being a $2 difference in the minimum wage. But what they found out, according to one study, was that the state that had the higher minimum wage, although it was a little harder for the businesses to maintain their situation, they had a much higher retention. They had lower attrition. They got to keep their workers because they were happier because they had higher wages to start with. So there could be two ways to look at this. And with that, Nick, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm going to provide a little context, because I think always when we have a debate, it's always a good idea to have some context. And so today I went to the department, or the Bureau of Labor Statistics from the U.S. Department of Labor, and pulled information on employment for the fiscal year of 2011. So in the United States, there are 140 million people employed in 2011. Of that, 74 million, or 52% of that total, were paid on an hourly basis. And of that, 4 million people made minimum wage or below, which represents about 3% of the entire workforce. So I just want to kind of give you a little bit of context on just about the number of people that we were saying are impacted by minimum wage, and why I think it's ultimately important. So we're talking about a relatively small amount of the workforce, but then it's also important to understand, if you're paying somebody $7.25 an hour, which is the federal level for the minimum wage, that if you're working 40 hours a week for 52 weeks a year, that's 2,080 hours. That means that you're making $15,080 a year working in the minimum wage. Which, if you're a minimum wage employee and you live in a two-person household, for example, the poverty line is $15,130. So you're not even making enough to get over the federal poverty line. So we're talking about small dollars. We're talking about people that are unskilled. Clearly, these are unskilled labor jobs, and the question then becomes, and what can we do to make sure that people that are making this wage can eke out a standard of living? And to me, that's the argument for it, especially when you set it at a level that impacts, like I said, 3% of the workforce. I understand the economic argument that price floors, they affect the equilibrium of the market. But when we're talking about setting a floor so low that it really impacts such a small amount of the labor supply, that equilibrium isn't impacted in such a material way that businesses will go out of business. Yeah, okay, they might hire one less person or two less people. Instead of 5, they might hire 4. If we're talking about small businesses where this really, really matters. At the same time, it does guarantee those people that are making that wage at least some relevant buying power, so that they can go and put some food on their table and whatnot.
Okay. Paul, you look like you might have a couple things to say about that.
Yeah, actually I do. We're not talking about people that are supporting family here. For the most part, we're talking about kids that are just getting into the workforce. We're talking about people that are trying to prove themselves in the workforce. Generally speaking, people don't stay at that level. People make minimum wage. I made minimum wage at one point in time. I think when I started it was $3.10 or $3.35 or something. I don't remember exactly.
Paul, you're supposed to go back in my day. when you walked uphill both ways to school. Sorry, go on.
When I was a kid, minimum wage was $4.25, and we liked it.
I'm just gonna point out that that's a bit of a false argument. Again, going right to the labor statistics, of those 4 million people that make minimum wage or below in the labor force, half of them are over the age of 25. So yeah, I get that they tend to skew to younger folks, but still, you're seeing quite a bit. 2 million people that are age 25 or older that are making minimum wage.
But you're not catching my point. This is not a permanent situation. People don't stay at that wage; they move up, and people that are up move down. In this country, we have an extraordinary amount of income mobility. There's ups and there's downs, and it just happens.
Right, and I'm just arguing for a certain shred of community decency. I mean, this is about making sure that folks that are trying to earn a job and have some sort of labor is different. I guess this is the thing. We complain about businesses having to pay an artificial floor for a certain amount of labor. We make a big deal out of things like the minimum wage. It's unskilled labor is really one of the few places where you don't, and again, this gets into the argument about unions and why we have unions and whatnot, but it's the one input cost for a company where there is a significant advantage for management with unskilled labor that isn't collectively bargained, because you can basically play individuals off of each other. Any other their input costs are going to come from other companies. If somebody had to buy copper, for example, they're going to have to go to a company that goes out and mines copper. And if there are only 3 companies that mine copper, then they're going to have to pay a higher price because there's less competition in that market. Labor doesn't work that way, to me the issue then becomes is it's not the question of a copper company that's going out and trying to make a profit, and if they have to lower their prices 10 cents, then their profit falls by that much. This is about people that are taking home a paycheck and trying to buy some groceries, and I think that's important, and I think that piece of it makes labor different.
Well, I don't know. Generally, I think we're talking about people that are trying to make enough money to take their girlfriend out for a date on Friday night. I mean, we're not talking about people that are supporting households. We're talking about people that are, just getting into the labor force. And I mean, it's a different situation. And through raising these rates, you're essentially taking a number of them out of the workforce. I realize you said that that's okay in order to make it better for everyone. But the problem is there becomes a point in time that it just doesn't make sense to keep those jobs in this country. It makes more sense to buy the same product from China, who makes it for tons less.
Well, now we're getting into a totally different argument, but I'm willing to get into this if you guys want to start.
No, I guess again, a little bit more context. I always kind of go back to, we can have theoretical debates, and we can have little touches of reality. When it comes down to it, there are 192 member nations to the United Nations. You know how many do not have a minimum wage in their country?
How many?
17. 17, and this is the likes of Yemen, Tonga, Suriname, Somalia, Qatar, Namibia. I mean, they're small countries. The only country on that list that has any bit of a decent-sized economy is Singapore. So there's 17 nations out of 192 that don't. And I'll freely admit, if you go and look it up, there are some nations within Europe that don't have, and large ones. I mean, you talk about Italy and Germany that don't have legislation governing a minimum wage, but they do have legislation saying that that wages have to be collectively bargained, which is the same as putting in. We're talking about things that have to be collectively bargained. It provides the same protections as a minimum wage. So, I get that we kind of talk about the theory of the idea of market supports messing with the market equilibriums is a bad idea. But the reality of the situation is most industrial nations think that there should be some level of support to its unskilled labor, so that they guarantee a certain amount of money to come in.
And Danon, let me ask you something that Nick mentioned earlier, talking about sort of the point of the minimum wage is also to make sure that the communities are able to kind of help prop up, and maybe that's the wrong word to use, wrong phrase, but help keep the people who are making minimum wage able to survive in the current economy and make a living, make enough to eat and put money on the table, all that. So what are your thoughts about the community having to sort of step up and provide that through legislation?
Last week we talked about the federal budget and how huge the federal budget was, and how there just doesn't seem to be anything to cut other than essential services. And I mentioned some redundant programs. And I understand that minimum wage is forcing the businesses to assume the expense, and it's not coming from the taxpayers, but it's being sold the same way as if it were, and it's being sold as if these poor people who just want to do right by their families and just want to make an honest living just have no place else to turn and have nothing else at their disposal. I mean, every program that we sell to the voters, to the taxpayers, is sold as if it's the only way to do this, and that millions will suffer if we don't pass this legislation or enact this program. I mean, $15,000 a year, I'm pretty sure, I probably should check this, but I'm pretty sure it's enough to start collecting some government benefits, food stamps, other kinds of assistance. I mean, I don't know what else to say, but the community that between private charities and federal, state, county, local governments all getting their hands in the pot, all enacting these programs to just help the less fortunate, I think it's a little bit of overlap, and I'm pretty sure that the people who are just trying to make an honest living have plenty of opportunities at their disposal, both government forced and private charitable, to do so. But especially considering, as Paul said, minimum wage is a starting position. Nobody who is the least bit competent stays at minimum wage for very long.
Okay. And Paul, you look like you got more to throw out there.
Well, actually, I was just going to reinforce that point, just that, honestly, we're not talking about people who have been in the workforce for 15 years. We're talking about people that are just joining the workforce, whether they're just out of college or whether they, have a job, in high school or whatever. I mean, it's relatively new folks to the marketplace. And that said, I do not believe that we're talking about theoreticals here. I mean, we're not. We're talking about things that are happening. We're talking about jobs that do go elsewhere because we can't afford to keep them here.
Well, what do you think about the Nick's point that 2 out of the 4 million are over 25? You have to assume some of those people have families, maybe even a significant number of them have families. If it's affecting those families, what do you propose as an alternate solution?
35% of them are married. 35% of them are in the age group of 25 to 54.
Well, 100% of them are having the minimum wages increased. That's another example of government legislation being one size fits all. It's all black and white. I mean, if we're so concerned about people raising families or supporting households on this, why doesn't the minimum wage take that into consideration? We just say there's a minimum wage for everybody, and it affects people in high school, it affects children, it affects retired people, it affects everything.
I'm all for stair-stepping it based on period, where people are in their life. You want to pay teenagers less than $7 an hour, but you want to pay somebody who's 25 and married more than $7 an hour, then that's fine if we want to get into that. But what I hear from you guys is that it's not a good idea to have minimum wage, and now we're talking about setting up one that's different for different people.
It'd be easier to swallow. I'd still oppose it, but it seemed to make a little more sense.
Well, I think it's clear that essentially we're talking about people that are just entering the job market. We're not talking about, let's check back.
We're
with
talking
these people.
about people that are unskilled, Paul. There's a difference between being. I know. Listen, I grew up.
No,
in the
there's not much of a difference.
No, I grew up in the restaurant business. I've seen the people
As
that.
did I.
Yeah. So I've seen people that have been working, waiter and waitress jobs for years.
I made under the minimum wage, as a matter of fact.
Most people in the food service industry do, because they get tips on top of it. So their tips and their lower than minimum wage hourly rate is supposed to be at least in excess of the federal minimum wage benefit. But there are plenty of people that are I just reject the straw man that we're always talking about it's a kid or somebody that takes out his girlfriend. There are plenty of people out there that are trying to make a living doing things that they're just not skilled at. They don't have the education necessary to move beyond that. They've learned how to wait tables, and that's what they do.
It's not about education. Anybody who is in a job for more than a couple of months or weeks even is no longer unskilled, as long as they're applying themselves in the least bit. Waitresses, line workers, McDonald's employees, anybody who works there for a few weeks can no longer be called unskilled.
But those jobs would be considered unskilled jobs that there isn't a requirement for you to have some sort of educational background to hold those jobs.
But they're not all making minimum wage, because at some point the company has an interest in keeping that employee on rather than hiring a new employee and retraining him.
Although you would have to be able to say that has limited upside. If I have a waitress that's good, I might provide her a certain amount of higher wage because she brings in more customers. But at some point, the gap between me hiring a new person that's unskilled that I can hire at minimum wage, and the fact that I might pay her $1 an hour more or $2 an hour more, but that gap can't get too large, because at some point, waiting tables is waiting tables. You don't need to have an educational background to do
it.
And that's how it is.
Exactly. That's what the market pays.
Sorry, hold on a second. Let me split that up. Paul said that's what the market pays. What did you say, Dana?
I said in the minimum wage law doesn't change that. That's the way it is.
Well, right.
But
I'm just saying that there are going to be plenty of jobs that are unskilled that are going to require absolutely no kind of education to do, and without a minimum wage protection, those people that are taking those jobs are going to be working for $3 an hour. They're going to make $15,000 a year. They're going to make $9,000 a year or $6,000 a year, and that's just unacceptable. I don't believe as a country that we can sit here and say that that's okay. There has to be a certain amount of decency here, that we can at least provide some people some sort of protection that says, okay, if you put in an honest day's work, you should at least make $7 an hour. That's not asking for a lot.
I have 2 points here. Let's look at this logically. First of all, let's check back with these people in 10 years, because statistically speaking, in 10 years, the greatest majority of them will not still be in that rung. Now, the second point is this. What if I change jobs and I decide to become a chef? Well, I'm not going to get paid very much. Absolutely. I would probably
get paid more than minimum wage if you went and got your education. You can't be a chef without going to chefing school.
That's kind of my point. If I went and I have no credentials as a chef. If I went and started, trying to become a chef now, I wouldn't get paid very much. I would get paid minimum wage. If I wanted to get paid less than minimum wage in order to get more experience, you say no. But what if I want to? What if this guy over here is going to hire me to work for less than minimum wage, and I'll get experience from him? What's that?
You can't do it.
Exactly.
Of course, there are ways around that, right? Because I could think of many, many unpaid internships that people take to learn skills like that, so they can get so as part of their education process.
Well, that's an internship. That has nothing to do with.
But you're getting the relevant experience that becomes part of your resume. I mean, there are ways that you can
absolutely,
do it.
And I believe me, I am all for internships. But the point is, I should be able to do that without a degree behind me. I should be able to go to a company and do some work for them, and have them pay me $0.25 an hour, if that's what I want. If that's what they want. If we both agree on that, that should be okay. The government shouldn't step in and say, well, you guys have agreed on that, but no, we won't let that happen.
Because the ramifications of that agreement has ramifications beyond just the two of you. And that's the reason.
It doesn't.
Sure it does.
It does not. It doesn't.
Because, yeah, it does, Paul, because you're saying that you're willing to work for $0.25 as opposed to 7.25.
It does.
Well, no, it just says that you're willing to work for $0.25, and people that do not have some sort of collective protection behind them will, $0.25 is better than zero. I want to be at least able to make $0.25 an hour. But then that tells other companies, well, I can break the law too, and I can go hire somebody else for $0.25 an hour. And pretty soon, the people that are going to benefit
the law.
Okay, so if McDonald's were suddenly able to hire its cashiers and its cooks at $0.25 an hour, what would they do with all the extra money?
Good question. It depends on what their priorities are.
Well, one option is to pay more to their shareholders and the company's CEO and president. Another option is to start selling Big Macs for 50 cents a burger, and
I suspect it would be a combination of both.
And run Burger King
because
out of it.
come on, you guys are economists. You understand that the pricing piece, the people will pay for a Big Mac what they value the Big Mac at. That's how pricing's set. Okay, it doesn't.
Competition comes into that as well.
It has absolutely nothing to do with. Yeah, it's all about supply and demand. It doesn't have to do with the cost of the product.
Let's make no mistake here. What you are saying also applies in the labor market. People will pay what the job is worth. Now, if you tell them that they can't pay what the job is worth, the job's going to go away.
No, it's not. It's not what the job is worth. It's what they can get away with paying. And when there is a distinct
what
advantage,
the job is worth. What they can get away with paying is what the job is worth.
Again, why we go back to labor is different. When there is a distinct disadvantage here. There's a distinct.
It's a market.
No, there's a distinct disadvantage of being in the labor market without any collective bargaining rights or any collective protection. Paul, I understand it's a market. It's a market with a floor. I get it. Okay, I'm not sitting here trying to pretend it's not a market. Okay, but you're talking about people here. We're not talking about copper. We're not talking about wool. We're not talking about beans. We're not talking about widgets. We're talking about people. And
because we're talking about people, we need to have the freedom to allow those people to negotiate what's best for them rather than having the government decide that this is what's best for you.
Yeah, but we sit here and pretend that the government's some abstract thing. The government isn't abstract. The government is a representation of the people. And if we're going to protect our communities, and this is what it always comes down to with you and me. It's about protecting the community above the rights of the individual. It is better for the community that there is a floor here so that the people can make $7.25 an hour as opposed to one person saying, you know what, I'll work for 50 cents. And then that has ramifications on everybody else that could possibly be making $7.50
You bet it
an hour.
does.
Yeah,
you bet it does. It has ramifications throughout the entire market because it brings prices down for everyone.
No, it does not. You guys sit here and you argue that the cost structure of the product that's being offered has some relevance to the pricing curve. It does not.
Labor sets a minimum for the product. If you cannot sell the product for the price they cost to manufacture it, then nobody will make that product.
Yeah, but if I can make a product for $3 and people value it at $10, it doesn't matter if I make it for $3 or $6. They will still pay $10 for it.
Until your competitor comes in and offers it for $5.
Oh, yeah, again.
Then you have to offer it for $4. Then they offer it for $3.
Wait, hold on.
But magically that there's absolutely no barriers to entry, that there isn't anti-competitive practices in the market. You sound like everything goes back to theory, and I'll go back to reality.
It's not theory. It's not theory. This is reality.
Major economic power in this world, in the United, not just the United States, has some sort of protection for its lowest unskilled workers in the form of a minimum wage or collective bargaining. And that's the reality of the situation. And it's because those things are needed to make sure that people can actually afford a bag of groceries.
China has billions of people, and, they certainly have way more than us, so communism must be right. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we need a minimum wage is what I'm saying.
Well, no, you're saying that everybody else has it, so we have to have it. And I reject the idea that just because other people jump over that cliff, that we need to jump over it too.
Minimum wage was established in the United States in 1938.
Yep.
Were we a third world country before 1938, or were we the beacon that people aspired to get to?
I'm not sure what the relevance is. Are you saying that there weren't people that? I mean, we can go back to before 1938 and look at the child labor situations in the sweatshops that were all over this country. That people weren't afforded the protections that I'm talking about right now. And we're going to call it was a beacon. But we're bringing it up as say before 1938, we're a beacon of where everybody wanted to be. Well, yeah, everybody liked the idea of America, but the reality of the situation is that there were people being taken advantage of because they had no ability to collectively bargain their rights. They had no ability or protection from being able to take advantage of, because the difference in power between the management of a company and one person looking for a job is so immense, it's unfair. It comes down to fundamentally it's unfair.
So what you're saying is that since 1938, since we passed this, we've taken poverty and ended it?
No, I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying that we don't have a ton of sweatshops, is sitting in New York City like we used to.
So you're saying the minimum wage applies to working conditions?
I don't know. Let's flip it around. If we want to talk theoreticals, you want to say, yeah, minimum wage absolutely does applies to not only working conditions but your ability to actually afford things. But I would also tell you that, flip it around. It's like we've had a minimum wage from 1938, and we've had some great growth in our economy. It didn't seem to destroy it, did it?
It certainly didn't destroy it, because business is one of those things that is very flexible and gets around these things in a wise
hallelujah.
way. They outsource, they bring in jobs from other countries and fix it in ways like that.
I think if I can, I imagine we're getting close to wrapping up. If I can make one more point, you seem to be ignoring the cause and effect, or minimizing it at the very least, in saying that if labor costs are reduced by eliminating the minimum wage, that businesses would not reduce the cost of the product. But I imagine that you'd have to acknowledge that raising the minimum wage would increase the price of the product, right? If we suddenly set the minimum wage at $20 an hour, how much do you think a Big Mac is going to cost? Can McDonald's be selling it for what they're selling it?
I understand that the cost structure of the product would make it either more profitable or less profitable. I mean, would people spend $18 to buy a Big Mac? I don't think so.
Right. So McDonald's will get out of the business, but that's aside.
Right. But you're right. It is a separate point.
But raising the cost that it makes raising the price that it costs a business to make that product is going to result in increased price of the product to the end consumer, is it not?
It can, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it will. I mean, it was the whole Papa John's, argument that he was going to, because of Obamacare, he was going to increase the cost of his pizzas. That only works if everybody else does it, right? So if he has the ability to go back to the competition idea that Paul said, if I can go to Pizza Hut and still get my pizza for $10 instead of $10.50 because Papa John's decided to take it up 50 cents because of Obamacare, it's the fallacy that the cost determines price. Price is determined by value. It's determined by supply and demand. So yes, if you cannot produce a product that is at a cost lower than the value people would put on it, then you will not make it, and you will move out of that market.
But
That is
supply and
100%
demand,
certain.
the supply and demand is affected by competition, is it not?
It is, of course.
And if
Because that
McDonald's
supply is.
lowers the
Supply
cost of a
is.
Big Mac 50 cents, and it gets that many more customers from Burger King, they're going to see that much more profit, right? There's a reason that they're not currently charging $10 for a Big Mac.
Right,
They
because
price
nobody
themselves
would pay $10 for a Big Mac.
And one of the main reasons of that is because they can go to Burger King or Wendy's and get a similar.
Yeah, but if the minimum wage
Products from a-
changes, it changes for all of them, right? Burger King doesn't have an unfair advantage.
Right. So here's my point. As the minimum wage is going up across the board, the cost of products are going up across the board. The cost of living is going up across the board. There's a constant cause and effect cycle here that the more employers have to pay their employees, the more through inflation, the more the cost of products go up. And then suddenly people come around saying, well, we can't afford to do this anymore.
I
We're
don't think
constantly raising one, the other raises, and we're never going to reach an equilibrium that's satisfying to the people on the left.
Well,
I believe that's called inflation.
Yeah,
Right.
it is called inflation, but I don't think that you're going to take a law that affects 4% of the workforce and going to create some inflationary pressure that's so great that it's going to throw our economy out of whack.
So
And
my point,
unlike Paul, I don't believe that all inflation's bad. If you have controlled low inflation of 1 to 3% in any given year, it's actually the sign of a healthy economy, as opposed to.
appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, okay, but of course, all right. Actually, we shouldn't get into inflation. That's another show. I'm sorry.
But so if you
My
drop
fault,
the
mea
minimum,
culpa.
if you drop the minimum wage, competition, the forces of competition through supply and demand are going to drop prices on average.
No, I don't agree. Because if I'm a businessman, if I can still charge, whatever the value of a Big Mac is, because whether or not my cost, I mean, companies do this all the time. That's what's called productivity. They're figuring out ways to increase their margins all the time, and they don't have a static margin. And so whether it's the cost of labor or the cost of raw beef or the cost of buns for the Big Mac, if they can figure out a way to make it cheaper to them, they will. That's what productivity is. They're not going to give it up on the price side unless they have to.
What about all the
So-
customers that they're losing because the minimum wage is just dropped? So we have people across, whatever 4% of the economy that suddenly can't make enough now to eat out. Isn't some company going to come in, some food restaurant going to come in and try to service those people?
No, because there's no money in it.
Sure there is.
No, there isn't. There's no money in it. There's no money in. That's why you need protections for the poor. There's absolutely no reason for a market to serve them because there's no value to be extracted from them.
Okay, guys, let me interrupt a little bit. I'm gonna sum up for a second and sort of, Nick, what I think what you're saying is, and just for my own clarification, and maybe some parts of the audience might be interested in this. What you're kind of saying is that there's certain people that get to a certain point and maybe they just don't have the intelligence, they don't have the physical skills, whatever, and they'll never get beyond what they start out at just because they're unlucky souls or whatnot.
That's not what I'm really saying. What I'm saying is that there are certain jobs that do not require skill set. That's what you have unskilled labor for. So in essence, you're talking about a commodity. Anybody can do it, and there's absolutely no reason to pay somebody more than what you can minimally pay them to do that job.
Okay, so then, right. So then, what's the point of the minimum wage then?
It's to protect them from having, from basically having a death spiral from themselves. So that if you're willing to do it for $7, but I'm willing to do it for $6.50, I do the job for $6.50. Then Danon comes along and says, "Well, I can do that job. I can do it for $6, and the job is, putting French fries into the fryer." The three of us could probably do pretty much the same job no matter how skilled we were, because the French fries go in, you watch the timer, and then you take them out, you get fries.
I don't know, I have a scar on my foot that says otherwise.
I think this is a good
You
note
might
to
be a little
end.
more skilled than I am.
Yeah, a good note to end the show on. Apparently, Danon's skill level is not quite as high as Nick's. All right, guys, I appreciate your time. It sounds like an argument that we'll never ever agree on, apparently. But we'll also have to catch back up at some point and talk about the other side of the planet, labor, which we've touched on that before on another show. But I think it might deserve another another touch. But anyway, thanks again for your time, guys. And again, for those of you watching, thanks for joining us. And tune in next week. We have another show. I believe the next one's about gun control, so we'll see how that goes. Thanks, guys. Paul, Dane, and Nick, have a good evening. Audience, thanks again for joining us. Good night.
Good night.
Night.